Maritime history is full of unexplained phenomenon and tall tales of sea monsters and, mariners going out and returning in different parts of the world and not knowing how they got there. You've abandoned ships. You have all these crazy things that happen out on the ocean. And many of them are just stories. We like to believe them because they're fascinating, but few of them actually hold up and are true. But one story, it is absolutely as fascinating as some of these very tall tales, but also happens to be true. Today, I'm going to cover that story, and it is the story of the lost Hawaiian fisherman. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have 5 highly experienced Hawaiian fishermen that take off on a daytime fishing trip. The weather turns really bad while they're out in the water and they don't return. Despite an extensive search effort, they are not located, and after a year, the families and friends of the lost fishermen, they host a memorial service and assume that their loved ones are gone forever. 9 years later, they make a discovery on a very small island 2,300 miles away that calls into question the entire story. It's an amazing story, it's a tragic story, but it's one worth listening to right to the very end. Before we get started, if you are into strange and mysterious stories like the one I've just described, my channel is going to be a bevy of content just like that. And so if you could gently liquidate, if you could gently liquidate, I can't even say it. If you could gently liquidate the like button, if you could gently liquidate the like button and subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. Scott Moorman was born in 1952 in the San Fernando Valley in California. At a young age, he loved the show Adventures in Paradise, which was about this crew of young sailors that would travel the South Pacific looking for adventure and passengers to pick up along the way. And it was just this brilliant show to him. And he became obsessed with living in the South Pacific when he got older. Specifically, he wanted to live in Hawaii. But that wouldn't necessarily happen right away because at a young age, he got married and had a son and stayed in California. But in 1975, he and his wife split up. And so he took that as an opportunity to go fulfill that childhood dream of living in Hawaii. And so he, on his own, his son stayed with his former wife. He, Scott, moves out to the east coast of Maui on Hawaii. And he moves into this little town called Nahiku. Now, Nahiku was full of lots of native Hawaiians and a growing population of kind of like refugees in a way, Vietnam veterans kind of that were over living in the mainland. You have hippies and kind of earth-loving people that do a lot more partying than working. They were all kind of congregating in this same town. And Scott, he loved that culture and he quickly became a part of it. But he also, unlike a lot of the kind of hippies that made their way to Nahiku, that were part of that growing population, Scott really wanted to kind of become a part of the whole culture of Nahiku because he growing up, he loved Hawaii. He didn't want to be the others on the island. He wanted to be a part of the main culture. And so he took it upon himself to learn the sort of pidgin English that locals would use. He took time to learn some of the cultural traditions that they had and really went out of his way to try to befriend some of the locals. And while he wasn't really embraced as, a kind of local, he did form a number of friendships with local Hawaiians, and in time he really felt like this is where he belongs. This was home to him 100%. So he would only go back to California one time. He goes back once for his son's birthday, and he also sees his parents while he's there, and they are all pleading with him to come back, be with your family. They want him to stay. And he says, no, Nahiku is where I belong, and I can't envision myself living anywhere else. And so when he flies back after that one visit to California for his son's birthday, when he flies back to Nahiku, that would be the last time that his son, his former wife, and his parents, his family back in the mainland would see him. That's the last they would see him. On February 11th, 1979, Scott and 4 of his friends decide that they're not going to go to work that day. They all worked construction together. Instead, they're going to go fishing because they all love to fish and the weather was beautiful, so they said, why not? Now, none of them owned their own boat, so they had to ask a friend who had a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Their friend allowed them to use it, and so they got their boat, they went to the store, got some beer, snacks, and got some ice for their big ice chest so they could pack it with the fish they caught, that they hopefully caught, and they were on their way. The part of Hawaii that Scott and his friends lived in, the east coast of Maui, at the time did not get any TV stations, and radio broadcasts were done maybe once a week and were hard to pick up. So people in that area, especially fishermen and anybody that was out on the water, they were accustomed to going out without a weather report. They basically played the weather by their eye. They kind of just sized it up and said, does it seem okay? Okay, it seems good, and they would go out. Obviously that's pretty risky, but the locals were pretty good at it, and Scott and his buddies also were very good at this point at kind of reading the weather, and so they thought this day was going to be just fine. Now, in order to get to the place where they intended to fish, they would need to pass through something called the Alanui-Haha Channel, which is considered to be one of the roughest and most dangerous areas for all sailors anywhere near Hawaii. So it's a dangerous place. It's at certain points, it is almost 7,000 feet deep. There's very strong surface currents. It's just a risky place to be if, for example, there was a big storm. Now, when Scott and the Sarah Joe crew took off, the water was calm, the weather was beautiful, and by about 10 a.m., when they believed they must have been in the channel at this point, the weather was still very calm. However, a low pressure system had picked up very suddenly between 10 and noon, and so when they probably were somewhere towards the end of the channel when they were going to be making their way into open water to fish, there was beginning to be torrential downpour all along the channel, and it eventually turned into a full-scale hurricane. So on the island, people described this particular storm as being one of the worst they've seen in 50 plus years. This is like a sudden, freak, horrible storm. Of the boats that took off to go fishing out of this East Coast section of Maui, there was 4 fishing boats that went out. 3 returned. The one that didn't was, of course, the Sarah Joe. At 5 p.m., the Coast Guard is notified by their friends and family that they have not returned yet. The storm is still raging, gale force winds, torrential downpour, but they still send out a plane to look overhead. A number of crews were sent out to go look for them, even with the incredible risk of searching in this weather. But considering the dangers they were in, they decided it was necessary. The searchers who were in the boats, the boat crews that were sent out to look for the Sarah Joe crew, they said that at best they could see maybe 50 feet in front of them, and even that was a stretch. So it was a limited search, but they did go out on the day of the storm. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard led a search that included 44 planes and boats covering a 56,000 square mile search block for the Sarah Joe, but nothing was found. There was absolutely no trace of them, and so after 5 days, unfortunately, the Coast Guard called off the search. However, the people in their hometown in Nahiku, they knew these 5 men. These were incredibly capable, very experienced fishermen. They were all great swimmers. They believed that because they hadn't found a trace of them, that perhaps they were still alive out there. And so they, as a community, raised $50,000 to pay private ships and planes to continue the search. So there was an extended search that went on for a couple more weeks that covered an even bigger swath of territory, but at the end still yielded no results. The people that were doing the searching were just baffled, because when people go missing at sea, there's some indication a lot of times when they're just fishing basically right off the coast, there's some indication of what happened to them. It's rare that you would have 0% found. Absolutely no idea what happened to these 5 fishermen. 1 year after their disappearance, the families and friends decide to host a memorial and mourn the loss officially for their loved ones. It was believed at this point that they had all perished. 2,300 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands lies this tiny little stretch of, I guess you can call them islands, called the Taongi Atoll. And these little tiny strips of land that were barely higher than sea level barely sustained any life. There was a couple scrub plants that took hold here and there, but there's no fresh water. The only recorded human life that's ever been there was during World War II. A number of Japanese soldiers were stranded there briefly, but it is 200 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It's very far from any major shipping lane. It's just a place that, as a human being, you don't want to go. In fact, it was actually considered, when they were testing the atomic bomb, when the United States was, it was considered to be a great spot to test the atomic bomb because no one's there and no one's anywhere near it. So incredibly isolated. On September 10th, 1988, marine biologist John Naughton, along with 4 other crew members, descended upon the Taongi Atoll. They were sent there by the Marshall Islands to find a suitable wildlife sanctuary for some sea turtles and seabirds. Within 30 minutes of arriving at the atoll, John and his crew saw what looked like a skeleton of a boat, a Boston whaler boat that was down on the shore. John was actually a resident of Maui, so he's from Hawaii, and he saw on the back of this kind of skeletal remains of this boat the letters HA, which means it's registered in Hawaii. And so he's intrigued because we're 2,300 miles from Hawaii, and he starts moving the sand away to get a better look to see if there's any more writing on the boat. And he makes out a couple of letters, an S, an R, an H, an O, an E, and he puts it together. He's like, this is the Sarah Joe. This is the boat that went missing 9 years earlier. And the reason he knew it that quickly is because he was one of the people deeply involved in the search efforts to find these lost fishermen. He was like leading search groups. He was totally committed to finding them. And here he is in a crazy twist of fate, 2,300 miles away, almost a decade later, finding the boat. Now, the boat did not initially provide any sort of information about where the fishermen might be. There was nothing on it. It was just the wood, very degraded from water, wear and tear. But the crew decided that they would search the island and just kind of look around, because perhaps the crew, even if it was years and years ago, maybe they landed here and then they ultimately perished once they were here. So maybe we can find their remains or just some sign that they might have been here. John walks about 100 yards away from the Sarah Joe, and he sees what looks like kind of a crudely constructed cross out of driftwood. And below it, he can see that there's a bunch of rocks that have been placed definitely in some sort of decorative way, and it looks like a gravesite. And considering what they're looking for, he thinks there's the first of the bodies that we're going to find. He calls over his crew, and so they begin kind of moving some things aside. They don't want to totally disturb the grave, just to be respectful. But a little ways down, the inside of the grave is not only bones, but they find this little book. The book had no writing in it, and it's hard to even call it a book. It was more like a stack of papers. But on each page, there was a little square cutout of tinfoil that sat on the page. Basically, every page had a little square of tinfoil and nothing else to it. No one knew what it meant, but undoubtedly, somebody had very clearly buried somebody else right here in a very shallow grave and had left this little book in here with whoever was buried here. And so while John and a couple of his crew are looking at this book and trying to make sense of it, one of his crew members that was just kind of standing back looking at the site commented that, the bones that are in that grave, they're not very bleached. Now, if a bone's been sitting for a long time, it will basically bleach and become totally white. Everything comes off the bone. These bones looked relatively fresh. So whoever was buried here, they had been buried recently. At this point, John and his crew have basically abandoned their kind of wildlife sanctuary research, and now they're just scouring this little scrub of land in the Taongi Atoll for any other signs of things that could have to do with the Sarah Joe crew, and they found nothing else. So they report back to the Coast Guard and alert the Marshallese authorities that what was found on the island, and they send out a couple of forensic experts to examine the bone. They were able to determine that the bones in the grave belonged to Scott Moorman. When news got back to the Hawaiian mainland that Scott Moorman had been found, the family members of the other 4 fishermen that went missing on the Sarah Joe, they hired private detectives to go scour the Taongi Atoll, look everywhere, see if you can find our loved ones' remains. And so this team of private detectives and a dive team and all these people are sent to the Taongi Atoll, and they look everywhere. They're digging up the sand. They have dive teams going out into the water. I mean, they are really leaving no stone unturned. And all they're able to find is the outboard motor of the Sarah Joe, which was a little ways off the coast from where the boat itself was found, wedged in some coral. And then they also found a handful of more bones on the beach near where that shallow grave where Scott Moorman was buried. But those bones also belonged to Scott Moorman. So there was nothing else found of the other 4 fishermen or any indication of what happened to the boat. There's nothing. And in fact, researchers that were able to look at the bones of Scott Moorman, there wasn't enough evidence there to help them determine a cause of death. So we don't even know how he passed away or when he passed away. However, it was determined just based on the bleaching of the bones that it was a relatively recent death. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but recent is the term that's used. While it was a very big deal that they located Scott Moorman's remains on the Taongi Atoll, even though it was 10 years later, this is revelatory. This is a really big deal, not only for the families of the fishermen, but for anybody involved. This is a really big deal. But there was an additional revelation once Scott Moorman's bones were found that basically turned this case upside down. There's already a bunch of questions like, who buried Scott Moorman? How did Scott Moorman become freshly buried almost a decade later? You know, how long had they been there? There's some basic questions that you're going to ask. But there's one fact that nobody seems to be able to reconcile, and that was 6 years after they went missing, the Marshall Islands conducted a government survey of the Taongi Atoll, which would mean they scoured the islands, all those little strips of land that make up the Taongi Atoll. They scoured it, just taking measurements and basically mapping out the Taongi Atoll. I think it was in preparation for potentially turning it into this wildlife sanctuary. So they looked everywhere on the Taongi Atoll 6 years after the Sarah Joe went missing. So they go missing. 6 years later, there's this government survey of the Taongi Atoll. And guess what? They ended up looking at that survey, and there's no boat, there's no shallow grave, there's nothing. It's just an uninhabited strip of land, nothing else. There's no boats there. Experts, when this was revealed, said that, well, had they, the Sarah Joe, the crew of the Sarah Joe, gone dead in the water following the storm, they could have drifted the 2,300 miles to the Taongi Atoll in roughly 3 months. But they weren't there at the 6-year mark. So what were they doing between the disappearance and the 6-year mark, which would have been the earliest they could have arrived, because prior to, they would have been discovered during this audit. So you have a 6-year gap where no one can account for where they were. Even if they made it to the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day after they had disappeared, that they had been somehow surviving in the open ocean for 6 years, and they just so happened to land at the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day later. Basically, just after the survey's done, let's say they make it there. Who buried Scott Moorman? And what was the booklet that was buried with him with the tinfoil squares? This is a totally uninhabited stretch of land. There is no one there to perform any sort of burial ritual. Even if we're willing to say that maybe one of the other fishermen buried Scott Moorman, well, then where are the other fishermen? Some people wonder, are they still alive? So like many of my videos, unfortunately, there isn't really a good conclusion here. It just kind of ends in a bunch of questions. But I would love it if you included in the comments section what you think could be the reason behind that 6-year gap. How can we account for those 6 years when they were not at the Taongi Atoll? I mean, my suggestion would be maybe the survey wasn't done very well and they just missed it. But that still doesn't also answer, well, who buried Scott Moorman? And also, Why were his bones not so bleached? How did he come to be freshly buried 9.5 years after he disappeared? No matter whether you believe this tragedy is the result of something paranormal or something normal and rational and explainable, no matter which way you feel, or maybe somewhere in the middle, the details of the story itself, the actual facts of the story, are horrifying. What actually happened to this poor family in the 1920s it's just one of the more terrifying ordeals that I've ever come across, and it's crazy to me that it's a true story. Without giving too much away, someone or something shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. One of the maids starts hearing strange sounds. They start looking for this person or this thing. They start seeing things moving around in their house, and there's every indication that someone is in the farm. Someone has snuck into the farm and is terrorizing us. And then on March 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the dark, strange, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then my channel is the one for you. That is literally all I do on this channel, and I upload 3 to 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, I would ask you to gently 360 no-scope the like button, subscribe, and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck Farm that was located in southern Germany in a very rural, isolated, heavily forested area. So the occupants of the farm were the live-in maid and the Gruber family. The Gruber family was Andreas, his wife Azalea, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, Joseph and Azalea as well. And everything was going fine for the Gruber family and for their farm until the winter of 1921, when some very strange things started happening on their property. The first one to notice strange things happening around their property was their live-in maid. She spent the majority of her time in the main house, and she was alone a lot of the time. And she started to notice when she was alone that she would hear tapping, what sounded like in the walls, not someone in another room tapping, but literally something in the walls. And she would go up and she would listen, and it would still be tapping, but she couldn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing those footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas would go up. Even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There was no food. There was nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas, he'd be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. And so she ultimately tells the Gruber family, like, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here another night. Whenever I'm here, I feel like I'm being watched. And at night, I can't sleep because of the footsteps in the attic and these voices. I know you've checked, but I can't be here anymore. And so she quits. And it really catches the Gruber family by surprise because they rely on her help. And so they're kind of thrown for a loop because they have to replace her. And so she leaves, and now they need to go find a replacement. Over the following 6 months, they would not find a replacement, and it would create an increased workload for basically everybody on the farm, which led to a higher stress level. Everybody's kind of on edge. You know, the departure of the live-in maid was a really big deal. And so you got to put that in perspective as you hear what happens over the next 6 months. At first, after the live-in maid had left, no one reported hearing any strange sounds around the house. You know, they were so busy that they didn't even have time to consider if there was any sounds in the house that they didn't recognize. But eventually, Andreas would later admit that he started hearing the tapping sounds and the footsteps in the attic and the disembodied voices, and no one's there. And so now he's becoming paranoid, and he shared his paranoia with the rest of the family, who's now also hearing these sounds and these disembodied voices and the footsteps, and despite checking and now searching the whole property, Like they've begun to like actually do a full-blown investigation. Everyone's just stressed. They don't know what it's coming from. They're mad at each other for like becoming paranoid. And so they just continue on with work and try to put it out of their mind that they're hearing these strange sounds. But the activity in the house would only intensify. What was initially just strange tapping sounds and what they thought were disembodied voices turned into things going missing around the house. Most notably, a set of their house keys went missing. And there's only so many people there. There's really not a good answer as to why they might go missing. And they only have a couple sets. It's a big deal to lose a set of keys, and they went missing and they couldn't find them. Once the keys went missing, the family couldn't stop thinking about the strange sounds in their house and wondering if there really was someone hiding in their house. And it was terrifying. And then when young Azalea, one of the grandchildren, suddenly went missing one night, the whole family is in full panic. They go out looking everywhere for her. They're yelling in the forest. They can't find her. And then finally they find her, and she has no idea how she got out, where she went, and what even happened. She just was like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how I got out. She was exhausted. She was confused. They brought her back to the house, and they're trying to get her to explain why you were doing that. She can't. They go back inside, and sitting on the table is a newspaper that Andreas didn't subscribe to. No one in the family had brought. No one even in the area, it would turn out, subscribed to this particular kind of obscure newspaper, and it's just sitting in their house. A couple days after that, they noticed that someone had clearly tried to break into their tool shed, which had loads of tools in there, very expensive. There was a lock on the outside, and there was very deep gashes into the metal. It looked like someone had been, hacking away at the lock to try to break it open. But, they're living in a very isolated part of Germany where there isn't much ambient sound. And so it was strange to them that someone had been so violent with this lock, like hacking at this metal lock, presumably with something metal, and no one had heard it or reacted to it. None of the dogs had heard it, nothing. So just very confusing stuff is starting to happen around the property. But it would be what Andreas sees in the spring of 1922 that pushes he and his family over the edge from general paranoia to outright panic. So Andreas wakes up in early March of 1922. There was this huge snowstorm the night before. He gets up early and he goes to the back door of his house and he opens it up, and he can clearly see that there are footprints that have walked from the forest, which is pretty far away from his property. They have quite a bit of acreage. There's footsteps that are clearly coming out of the forest all the way up to the door that he has now just opened. And he's looking down at these footprints, and there's no return set of tracks. And so he's thinking to himself, well, whoever walked up to my house came into the house. So he shuts the door and locks it and immediately goes and wakes up his family and says, hey, why are there footprints leading up to the back door? Because there's no footprints going away. Someone came to the back door and apparently came inside. His wife, his daughter, the grandkids, no one has a clue. The maid, nobody knows. They say, hey, we've been asleep. We have no idea. So now Andreas, he's obviously thinking about the strangeness that's happened in his house over the past couple of months. And so he's worried. So he opens the door back up and he looks and he's studying these footprints and he's like, I just don't get it. You have to turn around and walk back. Otherwise you're here, you're at the house. He shuts the door and he walks around his house. He looks at all of the different exits to his house. So he looks to see if there's exiting footprints, which is scaring him thinking about it, which means someone would have come into the house and jumped out a window or gone out another door, but he's just checking. And as soon as he makes sure there's no other footprints, he does a scan of his entire house. Because now he's convinced that someone's in his house. He goes to the attic. He goes all around. He's yelling. He's looking everywhere. There's nothing. There's no one in the house. The family's concerned, but there's no one in the house. So he keeps everything locked. And he goes outside and he starts tracking these footprints back to where they came from. And he walks all the way to the forest, and they just kind of stop abruptly. Like they just started kind of magically at the edge of the tree line and walked right up to his house, but there's no clear origination besides it's just in the forest somewhere. And there's also no clear sense of what happened once they arrived at the door. So after doing one more loop around his property, he goes in the barn, he goes in the shed, he goes back in his house, he's checking the attic, he's looking everywhere, and he can't find any indication that some stranger is here. He finally decides that he's going to tell someone about what's been happening at his property. And so they did have a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was his closest neighbor, who was not really that close, but a couple hundred yards away. And he goes over and he tells Lorenz everything. I've been hearing sounds. My maid quit because she was hearing sounds. We looked in the attic, we couldn't find anything. Then we started hearing sounds. The keys go missing. There's this newspaper in my house. My granddaughter's running out in the middle of the night. She's disappearing. She doesn't know what's going on. These footprints. I can't make sense of it. And so Lorenz, also not knowing what to make of it, suggests like, hey, I have extra weapons. You want to take an extra rifle and arm yourself, protect yourself? And Andreas just says, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm going to pass on the rifle. I'm probably overreacting anyways, and I'm sure we're just fine. But it would turn out he was not just fine, and he probably should have taken up Lorenz on the offer. So just a couple of days after speaking with his neighbor about the weirdness happening on his property, the Gruber family got a little bit of good news, which was they finally were able to locate another maid, a live-in maid, to come stay with them to replace the one who had left because she believed the place was haunted. And so a few weeks later, on March 31st, 1922, this new maid shows up to Hinterkaifeck. But unfortunately, this would also be the same date a horrible tragedy unfolds at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Over the course of 24 hours, someone or something was in the barn on Hinterkaifeck and was able to silently lure in members of the Gruber family one by one. Without telling anybody else what they were doing, they would walk over almost like in a trance into the barn where they would be struck in the head by something called a mattock, which is kind of like an axe. Blow to the head and they're down. As soon as they're down, whoever was in there, whatever was in there, would take their bodies and move them to the corner and lay them down, kind of square them up against the corner of the barn and then cover them with hay. And then as soon as they were deceased, he would go, whatever it was, would go back and lure in the next person. So over a whole day, each of these members of the family are being lured into this barn where investigators, nobody knows what it was that was luring them in. But they weren't scared when they went in. Their guard was down and they would go in and then get hit in the head with this mattock until there was 4 people stacked up in the corner. And at that point, the remaining 2 people on the farm were still in the house sleeping, and whoever was doing this went into the house and used the mattock to end their lives as well. 4 days later, on April 4th, a repairman who was scheduled to come to the Hinterkaifeck farm shows up to repair the feeding machine. He goes to the door, he knocks on the door, and it's locked, and he can see lights on inside, he can hear the dog barking inside, but no one comes to greet him. Now, the feeder was outside of the main house, and it was actually on basically a public area of the farm, so he didn't need them to physically get to the feeder, and he knew how to fix it. So after trying the front door, going to the back door, looking in the windows and seeing lights, hearing the dog, but everything's locked, he just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do the job. So he goes into the area where the feeder is, he does the repair, and as he's leaving, he notices that the dog that was barking, that was inside the house, is now outside the house tied up. And so he goes over to that section of the house thinking, oh, well, now I'll knock on the door and someone's sure to see me. And again, no one comes to the door, and the back door that clearly must have just been opened to let the dog out, is locked again. And so he's like, man, that's odd. And so instead of just leaving, he finishes the job with the feeder, and he goes over to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house, the neighbor, and he says, hey, just so you know, I was just over at the Gruber family's farm. I fixed their feeder like they wanted me to, but no one was there, but maybe somebody was there because the dog was inside, then it was outside. Don't know what's going on, but can you just let them know that I was here because I couldn't get in touch with them. But it prompts Schlittenbauer to go check on the Grubers because they haven't seen him in a couple days anyways, and so they figure they'll swing by and just make sure everything's okay. So they go over to Hinterkaifeck, and the lights are on in the house, the dog sure enough is outside, the doors are locked, and they see that the barn is actually open. So they go over to the barn, and in the barn, at first they don't see anything, but in the back corner underneath some hay are 4 of the bodies of the Gruber family. They go inside and they find the remaining 2 bodies, and no one else is there. Although there was signs of someone recently eating in the kitchen. The fire was lit, it was like the house was being lived in at that very moment. Although to Schlittenbauer and anybody that was there, they have no way of knowing that it's been days since the Gruber family had passed away. And so they end up leaving and getting in touch with authorities. So the police show up and they're able to determine with relative certainty that the tragedy took place on March 31st. But for 4 days afterwards, someone lived in the Gruber house, slept in their beds, ate their food, lit fires, lounged around inside, they played with the dog, they milked the cows. I mean, they like lived in this house. They ran the farm for 4 days. And other neighbors would even say that, yeah, we saw smoke coming out of the chimney on, April 3rd and April 2nd. And so it was confirmed that someone had been staying in this house, which is so creepy. And so the police are a little bit baffled, and they're like, okay, well then it was probably a drifter. Target of opportunity. They probably saw this isolated farm, and they probably were going to rob them, stay there a little bit, and then leave. But when they searched the farmhouse, there were large sums of cash that were just out practically in the open, like barely hidden, that had not been taken. And anybody that was robbing the place would have taken the cash. And so probably wasn't a robbery, which leaves maybe a crime of passion. But they were like, what's the motive? And unfortunately, Andreas was not particularly well liked in the town that was nearby. And so there was lots of people that didn't like Andreas, which made it really hard to whittle it down. So they started just interviewing like crazy. They're talking to hundreds of people that were in connection with, that could be connected to this, but they're getting nowhere. They did feel like Lorenz Schlittenbauer was probably the best suspect, because he's right there, he's right next door, he's their neighbor, and in fact he had wanted to marry Victoria, the daughter, and Andreas had told him outright no, and they thought that could be a reason. But like the big issue with Lorenz Schlittenbauer being the primary suspect is, he had a farm to keep and a family to take care of, and so how could he have committed this crime and then ran the Hinterkaifeck farm for 4 days and lived there and slept there without his family knowing? And his family's like, no, he's been here with us. And so the police, they aren't able to solve it. They don't really have any decent suspects, and so they kind of leave it with, well, whoever did this probably had been there for about 6 months, potentially, before they committed the crime, and then stayed there for a few days afterwards, and then vanished. And to this day, they have not been caught. And they even reopened this case in 2007. But they found that, despite the number of suspects and despite the evidence available, it just wasn't enough to provide any sort of clarity on what actually happened. So it remains a huge mystery. So like any other high-profile unsolved mystery, there are literally hundreds of potential explanations for what could have happened. But what I'm most interested in is what you all think could have happened. I will do my best to look through your comments, and I'll respond to the ones that are the most interesting or the most plausible. So please, if you would, in the comment section, let me know what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. In 1947, a disturbing distress signal was sent out kind of in all directions, like a blind distress signal, from some point in the Indian Ocean. Numerous American, Dutch, and English ships, along with other international listening stations, heard this distress signal. And once they triangulated where it was coming from, they sent out a search party to go see who needed help. When they arrived on scene, they discovered something that would become one of the most famous maritime mysteries of all time. This is the story of the SS Orang Medan. What's going on, guys? Mr. Ballen here. I was a Navy SEAL for a little while, and now I tell strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. YouTube is my new passion, and I'm going to be posting at least 2 times a week going forward. And if you like this kind of content, please right now hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any of this stuff. Thank you very much. Before we get into the story, I want you guys to be looking at this through the lens of trying to decipher whether or not you believe this really happened, because there is a large percentage of people that say this is just an urban legend. However, there is a couple details that make it really hard to just write off. Number one, you have a number of international ships and listening stations that all reported hearing this same distress signal, and it's a very unique distress signal that we'll get into. In addition, you have the U.S. Coast Guard in one of their, fairly credible publications published a story about this case 5 years after it happened. And then you have the fact that this case has been around since 1947, it's been 70 plus years, and no one's officially debunked it. So let's dive in. In 1947, several Dutch, American, and English ships, along with a number of listening stations, picked up the strange distress signal that was coming from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The distress signal, which was in Morse code, went like this.
An officer, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly Whole crew dead.
Then there was a burst of indecipherable Morse code, and then it ended with 2 words.
I die.
Then silence. One ship that heard this distress signal was the Silver Star. It was an American vessel that was kind of patrolling the waterways around the coast of Malaysia. And with the help of other ships in and around the Indian Ocean and some of the listening stations, they were able to triangulate the location of this distress signal. And they pinpointed a ship called the SS Orang Medan that was located right at the end of the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary shipping lane between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so this ship was basically drifting out towards the Indian Ocean. And so the first thing that the Silver Star does is they try to send a message back to the Orang Medan. But after numerous failed attempts, the captain of the Silver Star decides that we need to go investigate because something is obviously not right here. So the Silver Star tells all the other ships in the area, along with the other listening stations, that they are going to be the search party. They're going to reroute and head for the Orang Medan, because at this point, anybody that had heard that signal is saying, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go investigate? Are you? After a couple of hours of heading straight for the Orang Medan, they see off in the distance the ship. You know, from the eyes of these very experienced sailors on the Silver Star, they knew almost immediately that this ship is dead in the water. It's just drifting, which is not a good sign, especially if you combine that with the signal they got. As they get closer and closer to this ship, it becomes creepier and creepier because they're looking up, and in the bridge where, you know, the steering wheel would be, they can't make any person out. There's no one up there. There's nobody standing on the edge. I mean, they just sent this distress signal. You would think with a ship that's dead in the water that they would be lining the outside of the ship trying to signal someone down. But no, it's just quiet. No one on board, all lights off, just drifting, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean. And so as they get closer, they start blowing their whistle to try to attract anybody on the Orang Medan to signal them back. They're also doing more Morse code to try to get their attention again, not being picked up. And so finally, after all these failed attempts and just the general weirdness around it, the captain of the Silver Star decides, we need to board this ship. So the Silver Star crew members, they knew before they boarded that almost definitely they were going to find something terribly wrong with this ship. There's just too many red flags about it. They were anticipating something bad, but I don't think that they were really prepared for just how bad this was going to be. So they board the ship, and right away on deck is a number of crew members that had passed away. They're all deceased. And the mystery really kicks in the position, the body position of all of the dead crew members. They were all on their back with their hands outstretched in front of them as if defending themselves from some unseen assailant above them. Even strangers, they had this look of abject terror on their face, as if the final moments before they died were just excruciatingly painful and terrifying. Even the dog was in a position with its teeth bared. It looked like it was growling up into the sky. All of them. And so obviously the Silver Star crew members are, shocked at what they find. And they're kind of looking at each of these dead crew members and they're like, what is going on? So they make their way up to the bridge, and everybody's also dead in the same position, basically fighting with some unseen assailant in their final moments before they pass. The person who had been sending out the distress signal had literally slouched over the telegraph. Like, their finger was literally on the telegraph. He's the only one that was not doing this. He was on the telegraph and had passed away in that position. So they go down into the bowels of the ship. Normally, inside of a steel ship in the boiler room, it's going to be pretty hot. There's no real ventilation to speak of. Not to mention outside, it was over 100 degrees. They went down into the boiler room and down into the ship, and it was strikingly cold. Some of the crew members from the Silver Star said it felt like it might have been about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They found more crew members also passed away, also fighting with something in the air, with that look of abject terror on their face. So all of the crew has perished in this very bizarre way. There was no overt damage to the ship. It just appeared that the engine had been turned off, but ultimately the ship had no real damage to it at all. They couldn't find anything. The crew, despite meeting a fairly unfortunate end, also had no signs of outside injury, external injury. Something had obviously caused them all to perish, but there was no injuries outside their body. In addition, all of them showed signs of rapidly decomposing. Considering they had just been tapping away that distress signal hours earlier, unless the person communicating the distress signal had been the last one alive for a long time, it doesn't really add up that they had decomposed as quickly as they had relative to when this distress signal was sent. So the captain of the Silver Star, taking into account all of the strangeness, decides not to touch any of the bodies, leave them where they are, get off the ship, tie a tow line to the Orang Medan, and tow it in. We're going to have experts look at this and figure out what happened. And so they attach the tow line, the crew members of the Silver Star, and as soon as they begin to move it, they notice, the crew of the Silver Star, that smoke has begun billowing out of the inside of the Orang Medan. And so, not taking any chances, they cut the tow line and they literally jump back onto the Silver Star right as the Orang Medan explodes. In fact, there was a quote which basically said it exploded with so much force that it was lifted out of the water entirely and then splashed back down and rapidly sank. So now you have no evidence. You have the testimony of the people that were on the ship, but other than that, you have no evidence. The ship is now gone. The captain of the Silver Star and his crew just have to go back to the mainland to try to make sense of what they just saw, because you have all these people that were involved and want to know what happened, and they're like, well, let me tell you, we saw this horrible thing on board and then it exploded and it disappeared. And so that's where the mystery kind of ends. But here we go. Let's get into what the primary critique is, because that's important here too. And then we'll hear the rebuttal, which I think is also pretty important. So people that believe this story is just a legend will point to the fact that there really isn't a good record of the SS Orang Medan ever existing. There's this one very important publication called Lloyd's Shipping Registers, where you would expect the Orang Medan to be registered, but they're not. Others will say that, well, Orang Medan translates to man of Medan, and Medan is near Sumatra, and that's where they were registered. So they weren't in Lloyd's Shipping Registers, they were in another registry. But either way, there is contention around whether or not this ship ever existed. But for those who say that this could be true, they say that, well, there's a good reason why those records don't exist, because someone's trying to cover it up. According to a German researcher who had spent decades covering the Orang Medan case, he published in the Death Ship on the South Seas, it's a publication from 1953, that the Orang Medan was transporting illegal materials, things like nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. These are things used to create weapons. And there might have been a leak that led to the death of everyone on board. No physical injuries, but they passed away. And then also, after they tied that tow line, the materials could have detonated. Perhaps they detonated, that kind of thing. And so that still leads some questions, right? I mean, then how did the Silver Star crew not also get exposed? Every year, dozens of people, hikers, hunters, backpackers, will go off into the wilds of North America and then come out again claiming to have seen Bigfoot, the 8 to 10 feet tall, intelligent, bipedal, hairy creature that kind of is a cross between man and beast. And there's literally been thousands of sightings of that particular creature all over North America. And despite the thousands of sightings, there's never been a substantiated claim, so Bigfoot has become an urban legend. But no matter how you feel about Bigfoot, whether it exists or it doesn't, if you read through some of the first-hand accounts of these people who claim to have seen Bigfoot in North America, some of them are horrifying. And one account that stands out to me as being the most terrifying comes out of Oregon. There's a couple hot spots all over North America where some of the most sightings of Bigfoot occur, and one of them is in Oregon. In particular, it's the northwestern section of Oregon. And that's where today's story is going to come out of, and it is Jeff Boiler's story. Jeff was a Marine. He was then a police officer, then he became a deputy sheriff, and then he ultimately became a lawyer. What really stands out to me about Jeff's story is that he strikes me as a credible, skeptical guy who, when interviewed, because he's been on a TV show called Paranormal Witness on the Sci-Fi Channel, he did a follow-on interview. He's you can Google him, Jeff Boiler's Bigfoot sighting. The way he tells the story, it's like he's not trying to dress it up. He's not trying to make it more dramatic than it really was. It's like he's just telling you what happened to him. And he's not trying to create a theory as to what it was, but rather just, here it is. Here's what happened, as I remember it. And it allows you to listen to this story and really relate to it. And it makes it that much more eerie as you listen to what happened to him. And so today I'm going to be telling Jeff's story. But before I get into that, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format with lots of distracting hand gestures, then you have come to the right place, because that is all I do. And I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's something you'd be into, I would ask you to please gently disembowel the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. Back in 1997, Jeff Boiler was a fit, single guy that had been in the Marine Corps for a little while, and then he'd been a police officer, and now he was looking to do something new with his life, and he had always been a huge fan of nature. He loved hiking and hunting, and so he just kind of up and decided to move to Oregon to just be back in nature. And so he goes out to Oregon. He doesn't really know what he's going to do for a job. One of Jeff's friends, who is the elected sheriff of a very rural county in northwestern Oregon, reached out to Jeff and said, hey, with your background, you were in the Marine Corps, you were a police officer, would you want to be one of our deputy sheriffs out here in northwestern Oregon? And Jeff's like, wow, great, and took the job. So after being on the job for a couple of months, Jeff is really happy. He loves his job, and he gets off one day from work pretty early, and he steps outside, and he would recall that it was like one of the most beautiful days he had seen in recent memory. It was just this gorgeous day, and even though initially he was planning to just go home, he was like, you know what? I'm gonna go on a hike. He wanted to go to this fairly hard to access section of the woods that was a little ways up the mountain where 20 years earlier he had actually buried one of his very close friends. And so he thought, you know what, today I'm gonna make that trip up to his grave, I'm gonna pay my respects. That's a good way to spend such a beautiful day. So he hopped in his Jeep and he started driving over to the woods that would take him up to this gravesite. It was an unmarked trail, but he had a map, he knew where it was, so he headed over. Now, Jeff was highly competent in the wilderness, but it needs to be said that he was basically going to be hiking into a section of the Cascade Mountains that was unmarked. This is a very isolated, unmarked area. And in fact, Jeff would even say that sometimes when you would walk around this section of the Cascade Mountains, you would wonder to yourself, has anyone ever been here before? Like, this is such a wild and open expanse. Am I the first person to ever step foot here? It's a section of Oregon that is totally just wild. So Jeff arrives at the dirt lot that's right on the edge of this forest that goes up the side of this mountain. And before he steps in and starts making his way up, he gets his map out and he kind of roughly charts a course, because again, there's no trail in here. He puts his map away and he begins walking up this mountain. He's been walking for about 2 hours and the terrain's really bad. And he decides, you know what, why don't I deviate from the course that I was on and try to get to a more open area that might be able to kind of bank around to get up to the gravesite. He looked on the map and he could see that parallel to where he was going up this mountain, there seemed to be a strip of clearing where it might be easier going. It would require a bit of work to get over to it, but once he was there, he believed he could get up to the gravesite. So before he makes that movement over to the clearing, there was a stream running right next to him, freshwater stream, and so he just bends down, he splashes some water on his face, he gets a drink, and before he actually starts moving towards this clearing, because now he's deviating from the path that he intended to take, and this is an unmarked trail. So he knew that he would need to be really certain where he was going. He didn't have a GPS, this is 1997, he just had his map and compass. So he pulls out his map one more time, he looks at where he needs to go, he closes it up, and so he pulls out his compass and he takes what's called an azimuth, which basically is a way to make sure you're going in the right direction. And so he pulls the compass up to his eye, and as he's looking, he sees just to the right of his viewpoint, about 20 feet above him, there is a tree and a boulder, and behind that tree someone is watching him. And so he lowers his compass and he just kind of glances over, and he can tell that it's clearly a figure. It's got two eyes in its head and it's looking at him. And he's not immediately scared. He thinks that this is a person who's kind of poking their head around a tree at him. And it's daylight. He knows he's out in the middle of nowhere, but he's looking up at it. And he involuntarily cocks his head, like, huh? And this thing cocks its head. It's mimicking me. It steps out from behind the tree, and it's this huge, human-looking figure that looks very hairy. It's like 8 foot tall. And Jeff's looking up at it like, that's not a human. And so, not really sure what it is, he instinctively reaches for a sidearm, but he can't get it out of its holster. And he's like fumbling with it, and he's keeping his eyes on this thing that's, maybe 50 feet away from him, 20 feet up on this rocky outcropping. He can't get it out. And the figure's just looking down at him, and it's still got its head cocked to the side. He finally looks down to free his pistol. He draws the pistol, but the creature's gone. And he's like, I gotta get a better look. There was a tree that was pretty high that had a bunch of low branches that he could climb up. That would, if he climbed up maybe 15 or 20 feet, he could probably look over into this rocky outcropping. So he starts climbing up this tree, and he looks, and he's now level with that rocky outcropping, and he's looking out, and it stretches off quite a ways. There's a whole stretch of forest right there. And he's looking, and he can't see or hear anything. And he's starting to wonder to himself, like, did I really just see that? Is my mind playing tricks on me? Am I hallucinating? And so he decides, you know what? I'm going to climb back down, and I'm going to go up onto that rocky outcropping. Wasn't planning to, but now I'm going to, and I want to see if I can see some tracks or just see where this thing went. He's a Marine. He was a police officer. He was very comfortable in the wild. He just didn't really scare that easily. And so he's just kind of curious. And he's armed, And so he climbs down the tree, and he starts climbing up this like little rocky outcropping, and he gets up to where this creature was hiding. There's nothing there. There's no scent, there's no anything. And he just decides, you know what? I'm just gonna walk in the general direction that I think this thing went. Because where he was, which was this rocky outcropping, it kind of dead-ended because it's like a cliff. So he could pretty much only go inland and up this mountain. And so he just starts walking. And as he's walking, he's looking for signs that he could potentially attribute to this creature. He's listening really intently, but there's nothing. After about an hour, he's looking at the map and he's looking around at the terrain, and he's like, I think I'm lost. Like, I need to turn around now. And then it dawns on him that he's also lost track of time. It's starting to get pretty dark out, and he does not have a flashlight. So he starts to panic a little bit because he realizes that his curiosity has now put him in a very dangerous situation. He doesn't have supplies to stay the night. He doesn't have a flashlight. It's getting late, and he's potentially lost. So he tries to compose himself, and he just says, okay, I'm just gonna turn around and walk back, because he hasn't seen any indication of this creature or this person or whatever it is. So he turns around and he starts backtracking as best as he can. And as soon as he starts moving back, from behind him, he hears what sounds like a very large tree break and smash into the ground. And he described it as being louder than most guns. Like, it's an extremely loud sound. And he turns around and he looks, and there's nothing there. But he just figured, that's crazy. Like, I'm lucky that no tree landed on me. He's not thinking that could be, Bigfoot. He's thinking that a tree just fell and I'm lucky it didn't land on me. And so now, even though he is not connecting the falling tree with this creature or person he saw, he's in a bit of a panicked state. And so he can't help but associate the experiences. And so he finds himself, as he's walking now a little bit faster and faster away from where he just was, looking over his shoulder in the direction of where that tree fell and where he believed this creature or person was. And as he's walking, looking ahead where he needs to go, but then peering over his head, over his shoulder, over and over again, he hears another loud snap and fall, and it stops him dead in his tracks. It was ahead of him, off to the right, basically on the exact opposite side of where he had come from. And he's thinking to himself, in all the time that I've spent in the woods, it's so rare to be around a tree suddenly falling, unless it's being caused by another tree falling or some other event. It's rare that you would hear two large trees break and fall independent from one another in the same small area but not connected. That's pretty rare. And he's thinking to himself, if that creature or person had anything to do with it, how did it go from over there to all the way over there without me hearing it. It's moving around without me being able to spot it. And so the hair on the back of his neck stands up and he's starting to feel very uncomfortable. He's being hunted. And so he keeps on walking the path, but begins to veer off away from the second snap that he heard. He figures, I'm just gonna split the difference and kind of go a little bit to the left and avoid that falling tree, still keep my distance from this falling tree, and just get down the mountain as quickly as I can. And so as he starts moving in this kind of slightly new direction, he hears a third falling tree. And now it's back on his left side, closer to that first one he heard, except it's closer to him now. He turned around and he couldn't see the result of a large tree falling. He certainly heard it, but he's looking and he can't see anything. And he's thinking to himself, like, 3 falling trees, that is not innocent. Something is knocking over these trees. And I think it's that creature I saw. And even worse is he's thinking to himself, is this creature using these trees to signal to other creatures where he is? Is he being tracked? It's getting closer to him without giving away its own position. He really believed he was being hunted. And so he starts sprinting down the mountain. And as he's running, he's hearing snap, fall, snap, fall. These massive trees are being knocked down on his left and his right side, like you have 2 hunters basically following him, or it's the same one that apparently can move around in the wilderness without being spotted. And he is absolutely terrified. He's running down the mountain, he's falling, he's getting smashed up every time he falls. And he finally, after about 30 minutes of just running straight downhill with these crashes getting closer and closer and closer to him, he reaches this clearing and he stops abruptly because there's an animal in the middle of the clearing, and it's a deer. And the deer doesn't seem fazed by Jeff. The deer sees Jeff, looks behind Jeff, just off to his side, and it tilts its head back and then turns and sprints away. It wasn't running from Jeff. It was running from whatever was right behind Jeff. And Jeff stops and he starts turning his head in the direction of where the deer was looking, and he can't see anything. And as he's looking, another tree slams, smashing down right behind where he was. He takes off sprinting. He knows he's maybe a half mile from his car at this point. And now, as he's sprinting through this field, all he hears is just a cascade of these crashing trees as he sprints the final stretch to his car. He pulls out his key and he starts clicking the automatic locks, and he can't tell if it's working. And he's panicking that it's not going to work in time and he's going to get to his car and it's going to be locked. And he's fumbling with his keys to open the door, and now the crashing has all stopped. And he's just waiting for this thing to jump out and grab him. He manages to open his car, jumps inside, slams it, starts it up, and peels out of there. And then he went back to his office where his sheriff was, and he told him what happened, and he felt ridiculous telling him. And his sheriff was like, I get reports like this all the time. This side of the Cascade Mountains, in that very remote section that you were in, we get reports like that all the time. I believe you. If you want to file a report, go for it, but chances are good it's never going to be followed up with. This is just a phenomenon of being out here in the wilderness. Some people believe it, some people don't. Decades would go by and he would finally share his story, which is why we're hearing about it now. But when he tells that story, if you watch it on Paranormal Witness, you're listening to it like it happened yesterday. This has stuck with this man, and it's clear it had a profound impact on his life. So while there's never been any substantiated claims of Bigfoot actually existing, some of these reports are eerily similar to one another, and some of the people detailing these sightings are people like Jeff, who really has no reason to lie or embellish. He doesn't really stand to gain much. In fact, he stands to lose, because he could be labeled as kind of like a kook for believing that Bigfoot chased him. So the way I like to look at stuff like this is just to keep an open mind. We don't know half the stuff that's in our ocean. You know, we barely know anything in the universe. What's to say that there isn't some creature like Bigfoot that's managed to evade, legitimate proof that it exists? I think it's certainly possible. It doesn't mean that I fundamentally believe it's true. It just means that I retain an open mind. But I want to know what you think chased Jeff through the woods. Was it Bigfoot? Was it something else? Or was this just some hoax?